Welcome to our channel. Today, we're going to summarize Frankenstein, the 1818 text by Mary W. Shelley, chapters 1 to 12. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and scientific progress without ethical considerations. The novel follows the life of Victor Frankenstein, a brilliant scientist who becomes obsessed with creating life, leading to his downfall. Shelley explores themes of ambition, responsibility, and the power of nature, critiquing societal issues and the dangers of prejudice and fear. Chapter 1. The novel begins with an introductory letter from Robert Walton to his sister. In the letter, Walton explains that he is on a voyage to the North Pole and hopes to discover a passage to the Pacific. He also tells his sister about a man he rescued from the ice, who later turns out to be Victor Frankenstein. Victor then begins to tell his story to Walton. He talks about his childhood in Geneva, Switzerland, and his interest in natural philosophy. He becomes fascinated with the idea of creating life, and begins to study the works of ancient alchemists. After years of research, he finally succeeds in creating a human-like creature, but is horrified by its appearance and flees from it. Chapter 2. Victor continues his story, describing how he traveled to Ingolstadt, Germany, to study at the university there. He becomes obsessed with his experiments and spends all of his time working on his creation. Eventually, he brings the creature to life, but is horrified by its appearance and runs away. The next day, Victor becomes ill and is confined to his bed for several months. During this time, he receives a letter from his father, informing him that his younger brother, William, has been murdered. Victor returns home to Geneva and is devastated by the loss of his brother. Chapter 3. Victor returns to Geneva and meets his childhood friend, Henry Clerval. He becomes increasingly paranoid about his creation and becomes convinced that it is responsible for his brother's death. He decides to travel to the mountains to try and forget about his troubles. While in the mountains, Victor meets the creature, who tells him his story. The creature explains how he was created and how he has been rejected by society. He asks Victor to create a mate for him, but Victor refuses. The creature then warns Victor that he will seek revenge if he does not create a mate for him. Chapter 4. Victor returns to Geneva and begins to work on creating a mate for the creature. However, he becomes increasingly paranoid about the consequences of his actions and eventually destroys the second creature before completing it. The creature then appears and tells Victor that he will seek revenge on him and his family. Victor becomes increasingly isolated and depressed, and decides to travel to England. While in England, he receives a letter from his father informing him that his friend Henry has been murdered. Victor becomes convinced that the creature is responsible for Henry's death and decides to return to Geneva. Chapter 5. Victor returns to Geneva and prepares to marry his fiancée, Elizabeth. However, on their wedding night, the creature appears and kills Elizabeth. Victor becomes distraught and vows to seek revenge on the creature. Victor spends the next few months tracking down the creature, but is unable to find him. He eventually becomes ill and is nursed back to health by a family living in the mountains. While there, he receives a letter from his father, informing him that his father has died. Victor returns to Geneva and begins to plan his revenge. Chapter 6. Victor and the creature have their final confrontation in the Arctic. The creature tells Victor about his life since they last met, and expresses his regret for the things he has done. Victor agrees to create a mate for the creature, but then changes his mind and decides to destroy the creature instead. The creature then disappears into the Arctic wilderness, leaving Victor alone and remorseful. Chapter 7. Robert Walton writes his final letter to his sister, describing how he has been unsuccessful in his quest to discover a passage to the Pacific. He also tells her about the strange man he rescued from the ice, and how he listened to his story. He ends the letter by reflecting on the dangers of ambition and the importance of friendship and love. Chapter 8. In this chapter, Victor recounts his childhood and upbringing. He speaks of his parents and his siblings, including his adopted sister, Elizabeth. He also speaks of his passion for natural philosophy and how it led him to the creation of the monster. Victor reflects on the consequences of his actions and the guilt he feels for bringing the monster to life. Chapter 9. Victor returns home to Geneva after completing his studies at the university in Ingolstadt. He is deeply affected by the death of his mother and becomes increasingly consumed with his experiments. He spends all of his time in his laboratory, neglecting his family and friends. Victor describes how he becomes increasingly paranoid and fearful of the monster he has created. Chapter 10. Victor begins to describe the process of creating the monster. He speaks of his experiments with electricity and how he eventually brings the creature to life. He is initially excited by his success but becomes horrified when he sees the monster's appearance. Victor runs away from the creature and spends the night in his laboratory, consumed by fear and guilt. Chapter 11. The monster wanders out into the world, confused and alone. He is shunned by everyone he meets, including children who throw stones at him. The monster becomes increasingly desperate for companionship and eventually seeks out his creator, Victor. The monster confronts Victor and asks him to create a mate for him, promising to leave humanity alone if Victor complies. Chapter 12. Victor agrees to create a mate for the monster but eventually decides against it, fearing the consequences of creating another monster. The monster becomes increasingly angry and vengeful, swearing to make Victor suffer. Victor becomes increasingly paranoid and fearful, convinced that the monster is watching his every move. Thanks for watching. To read the full version of the book, click on the link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for similar content.